coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
A big sticking point from the Obama JCPOA is that the Iranians didn't allow any Americans to be part of those inspection teams, which, if you ask some, opened up the chances of fraud or evasion pretty significantly. And so that's one kind of thing that I would look for if there's openness from the Iranians, to have Americans as part of the inspection teams and reviewing their nuclear facilities, wherever they are and whatever they become in the future. And then the other thing is the enrichment levels. There's some messaging that I've been paying attention to that has changed over the last 10 days. It was obviously, the enduring message has been no nuclear weapon for Iran. But even since Israel started their campaign of airstrikes, there was this discussion of zero enrichment, no uranium whatsoever. And that's changed certainly to the absence of highly enriched uranium. Like, these are the levels that Vice President Vance in particular has been talking about on a lot of his media appearances. And then President Trump, in front of the press pool, has been explicit on his expectation that they don't have a means of weaponization.
Welcome, everyone, once again to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast at the American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I'm back after a week in the wilds of Trump country in Western North Carolina. More on that later. I'm your host, Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute and publisher of the Claremont Review books and the American Mind, joined by a full host of folks today. We will be joined in a little bit by Will Thibeau to talk a little bit about Iran, but for now, I am joined by newly christened MEGA editor of the American Mind, Spencer Klavan. We were just commenting on he looks slightly Persian, maybe.
And it is MEGA, not MIGA, I think.
That's right. It's got to be MEGA.
Yeah, got to be MEGA.
Managing editor of the American Mind, Mike Szabo, and joined also by frequent guest commentator here on the American Mind podcast, Seth Barron, who's now fairly new in a position that's perfectly suited for Seth's talent at the New York Post. So go read him there. And read him everywhere. And Matthew Peterson, editor of Blaze Media and Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute. Matt, of course, worked at Claremont for many years, off and on, most recently as Vice President of Education and founder of this podcast in many ways and the American Mind website. So it's good to have Matt back in a moonlighting role and doing good work in DC. And he will grace your ears every few weeks here on the Roundtable. Well, we wanted to start with not Iran, actually. Little head fake, but actually with Skrmetti, we're in the wonderful season that comes every late June of controversial Supreme Court decisions. This one is United States versus Skrmetti. It had to do with the constitutionality of a Tennessee law, SB 1, which outlawed gender-affirming care, as it's euphemistically and stupidly known, basically prohibiting puberty blockers and surgeries for minors, except in the rare cases, especially with the puberty blockers, not really the surgeries, rare cases of precocious puberty and real medical applications of these sorts of things. And a good opinion, well, not perfect, but interesting and good opinion by Gorsuch, assigned to him, I expect, by the chief, because, well, usually they get assigned for a mix of compelling arguments and other reasons. The other reasons here being, I think, Gorsuch's desire to distinguish his worst ruling on the court still and probably forever, Bostock, in which he made the argument somewhat strained and fantastic to many of us a few years back that for reasons of Title VII interpretation of the Civil Rights Act, sexual orientation was included in the term sex in the Civil Rights Act. Go check that out and check the criticism of it to refresh your memory, if you like. But he wanted to distinguish this case from that case and did so by saying, basically the holding is we don't want to get too arcane with all of the terminology from the court. But the court basically said, look, this is not a protected class of people. The legislation in question does not discriminate on the basis of sex. It bans this sort of stuff for all minors, regardless of sex, and really limits it to just medically necessary treatments for very rare abnormalities like precocious puberty and things like that, and bans this rising craze for sex reassignment and puberty blocking and all the rest to quote unquote address the gender affirming needs of trans youth. This it's interesting. One has to wonder. There's been some editorial evidence from left of center writers at the New York Times and elsewhere that I think secretly a lot of the left welcomed this decision. It basically returns this issue to states and state legislatures. The court declined to say that gender affirming care is somehow mandated by the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so they wanted to, following their Dobbs decision, return this to the states and to the judgments of legislatures. The arcane legal term for this is that it really just needs a rational basis test. So state legislatures, given the controversial state of medicine, quote unquote, medicine on this topic, are free to examine the risks that might be posed to children and are free to ban this activity. Just a couple highlights from Thomas's opinion, which I think are worth reviewing. Basically, his conclusion sums up most of his argument, but I wanted to give a quick little shout out to his excellent little post on experts as well. But here's the conclusion of his concurring opinion, which I recommend everyone read. In all these sorts of controversial cases where Thomas concurs, just go read that first. Usually gives a pretty good summary and gives you the closest thing you would like to both an easily understandable opinion in the older style of Supreme Court opinions. It's not too overladen with jargon and legalese, but speaks plainly as they should. This is his conclusion. This case carries a simple lesson. In politically contentious debates over matters shrouded in scientific uncertainty, courts should not assume that self-described experts are correct. Deference to legislatures, not experts, is particularly critical here. Many prominent medical professionals have declared a consensus around the efficacy of treating children's gender dysphoria with puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgical interventions, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. They have dismissed grave problems undercutting the assumption that young children can consent to irreversible treatments that may deprive them of their ability to eventually produce children of their own. They have built their medical determinations on conceitedly weak evidence, and they have surreptitiously compromised their medical recommendations to achieve political ends. The court today reserves, quote, to the people, their elected representatives, and the democratic process, the power to decide how best to address an area of medical uncertainty and extraordinary importance. That sovereign prerogative does not bow to major medical organizations. That's him quoting Sotomayor saying, basically, look, all the medical experts say that this is necessary and essential to children's health. Experts and elites have been wrong before, and they may prove to be wrong again. And in that, actually, he's quoting Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard. So this was an opportunity for Thomas and others in the majority to cite their recent precedents and to continue their legacy of a return to sanity in jurisprudence. I just want to read one footnote where he takes a pot shot at Sotomayor because it's just fun. Inter-court fights are always fun. So here's Thomas taking a little bit of a shot at Sotomayor as he did in his conclusion, but here in a footnote halfway through. Justice Sotomayor suggests that the restrictions on gender dysphoria treatments imposed in Norway, Sweden, and England are inapposite because these countries still permit some treatments where medically necessary, whereas Tennessee's SB1 does not. But states might reasonably question whether any of the banned treatments are medically necessary, as the supposed experts in the field have adopted an exceptionally broad understanding of that concept. Consider the guidelines chapter. This is the WPATH, the leading standards of care trans kid organization. Consider the guidelines chapter on those who identify as eunuchs, a group that includes individuals assigned male at birth who wish to eliminate masculine physical features, masculine genitals, or genital functioning. During a deposition, an author of the guidelines confirmed that WPATH's official position is that castration may be medically necessary, even where a male who identifies as a eunuch and seeks castration has no recognized mental health conditions, and where no finding is made that he's actually at high risk of self-castration. This expansive understanding of medical necessity would seem to justify any medical intervention so long as it might help individuals better align their bodies with their gender identity. There he was quoting W. Path again, and presumably animates W. Path's conclusion that surgical interventions can constitute medically necessary gender-affirming medical treatments in adolescence. Given that the limits of medical necessity in this context are debatable, states might reasonably decline to provide exceptions for it, particularly where, as here, they have reached the conclusion that specific procedures for children are experimental in nature and may carry unknown harmful effects. One final note on the virtue of Thomas's opinion. He goes through in some detail these different categories of the sort of grisly medical detail of what actually gender reassigning surgery consists of in both male and female boys and girls, or children, I should say. And so the whole concurring opinion is a great service to the layman. So I encourage everyone to go read it, even if you're not in the normal business of reading court opinions. I said one final note. Now I have one final note. Thomas also takes a swipe at Gorsuch and his Bostock opinion. And he basically says, that was a Title VII decision. That means that was a statutory interpretation decision. We really don't need to use Bostock at all for any questions of 14th Amendment jurisprudence. So courts should just ignore it for these purposes. A good day for sanity and jurisprudence.
Yeah, it's nice that Gorsuch had a chance to redeem himself after Bostock. The problem is that this decision seems to be directly in contradiction with the reasoning of Bostock. I mean, as I understand it, right, wasn't the thing with Bostock that you can't fire a man for wearing a dress if you wouldn't fire a woman for wearing a dress, because the only thing that's different is their sex. And now this case, rightly, I think, decides that there's an actual difference between taking puberty blockers to stave off early onset puberty and taking them because the Empress of Siam requires a sexually impotent young boy to guard her chambers, or because you just want a higher singing voice, right? Like this is sort of the question here is, like, at what level do you take in the context of the situation in deciding whether there's a legitimate basis for discrimination? And Gorsuch has obviously made the right call here and the wrong one in Bostock. I just don't know exactly how you can reconcile the two from a kind of Clarence Thomasian, like, common sense level. But yeah, I mean, like you say, Ryan, it's such a win, and so many things, it should be noted, led up to this, in the same way that the Dobbs decision took 50 years of legal argumentation, careful work, activism, and so forth. This trans thing, which flared up in the public in 2020, has been kind of long in the making, is constructed of many different strands, a kind of weird academic fog of abstractions that is meant to intimidate regular people from saying the normal common sense thing, a regime of political correctness that makes people feel bad for observing reality, and then this kind of elaborate legal architecture that enforces a kind of willful blindness on guys like Gorsuch when they feel like they can't say, because of civil rights law, that, like, men wearing dresses are different from women wearing dresses. By the same token, there have been many, many intermediary efforts along the way to this decision. I'm thinking especially of the Cass report in the UK, which caused to collapse that entire W path document, Ryan, that you mentioned, the standards of care, which is an utterly fallacious document based on legal legerdemain and a lot of really badly done so-called medical evidence. Countries in Europe have been kind of reviewing this for a long time and rolling stuff back, which they are able to do, I think, more directly because of their nationalized healthcare systems. But yeah, there's just, like, this is kind of the culmination of a lot of good stuff. And it has to be said, you probably wouldn't get this decision without Trump appointees on the court.
What would have happened if Tennessee had banned, transgender medicine for everyone? like for adults too.
That's the big next question, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me unlikely that the Supreme Court would have upheld that law. I mean, isn't the fact that this is just about children what separates it from like Bostock? I mean, to me, that makes it a lot easier to defend, not even to defend, but just to agree with what the Supreme Court did. I mean, because there's such a, I mean, it seems to me like the real present danger is that with social contagion, children who aren't really like, let's pretend that gender dysphoria is real and that it occasionally really destroys a child's life. It seems like there's still a greater danger that many people will get caught up in the social contagion and have their lives permanently ruined by undergoing this, like, you know, devastating chemical treatment, which is irreversible, rather than having to wait a few years before you begin your transition. I mean, it seems to me, isn't that like kind of the major thing here? Like the fact that it's like about children and not
That
about.
is, I think, something that Gorsuch says in the majority opinion.
Okay.
And it's kind of analogous, I think, to the question whether the logic of Dobbs would support a nationwide abortion ban, or whether it really is just a states' rights issue, or it puts it back to the states, right? It's like the text of the decision makes it a point of saying the thing that is dangerous or offensive or problematic about this is that kids aren't in a position to make these sorts of decisions. The rationale of the law and of the kind of broader cultural movement seems to me to have something more to do with, like, this is in itself an inherently kind of bad thing to do. So, I mean, Ryan mentioned the relief, the kind of muted relief on the part of the New York Times. Like, I think especially of a piece that Emily Bazelon wrote a while back about, like, look, this stuff really doesn't actually seem to be as clear cut as our friends on the left would like to say. And that relief is, like, tempered right now, I think, by the fear that there's a broader, like, logic at work here. So yeah, I think you're right, Seth, that this is a much more appealing decision to a much broader contingent of people because it's about protecting kids. I don't think, though, that that's the only argument that will now ensue over trans
Right.
stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this, I mean, clearly is the right decision. I mean, it says a lot, you know, kind of reading some of the dissents, some of the kind of just torturous logic in there. But in some way, I mean, I just keep thinking about, I mean, you know, with the Roberts Court in general, I mean, clearly, you know, you read Thomas's concurrence, you know, there's certainly some good legal reasoning in there, especially with the Claremont Institute's own Center for Constitutional Jurisprudence, I think, had an amicus brief in this. And I think the court followed their logic, I mean, almost every step of the way, actually. So definitely props to John Eastman there and his team there for certain. One thing that they didn't do was in the Claremont brief, in the CCJ brief, it was they focused really on the history of sex as a binary, as something, you know, immutable, that is unchangeable. And the court really kind of declined to really go into the history of that, which it just shows that there's just, I think, still so much work to be done. I understand lawyers have to make arguments to appeal to where people are at now, but there's still so much to get done in terms of to really get back, peel at the foundation of this stuff. You think about how Clarence Thomas learned about the American founding, about the Declaration, about the Constitution, learning from Eastman himself, learning from John Marini, learning from Ken Masugi and kind of the Natural Law Foundation. And you really wonder kind of, when is that really going to come back? And when are we going to kind of go away from a lot of the tests for the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment today and kind of really get back to some of the kind of really the bedrock thinking that, you know, the founders, those who framed and ratified the 14th Amendment, you know, really thought kind of their moral universe. You know, we're obviously, I think, moving in the right direction, but, you know, is it fast enough? And so I think, you know, I hope that, you know, we'll kind of explore that in more opinions to come.
Yeah, on that front, Mike, I wonder, there might have been I saw some evidence of a bit of a cross-conservative coalitional aspect to how some of these opinions were crafted. Thomas joined Amy Coney Barrett's opinion, where she just basically wanted to write separately to say that transgender youth are not a special class, protected class under the 14th Amendment. And I think if Thomas had started using the N word, that is nature, it might have broken up the coalition a bit or caused some trouble. So I bet that Roberts and Gorsuch and the crew in the 6-3 majority kind of pulled some of their punches, or certain members of it, so they could get more ecumenical endorsement of their various opinions.
But as you pointed out, Ryan, it is important, at least the cutoff from the experts, what Thomas is saying. So it seems like it's not going to common sense or to nature, but at least it's going to state legislatures and away from experts. So
yeah,
we got like a step one plateau, I suppose.
Yeah, and Thomas had a nice little section where he said, this WPATH report, has been criticized by the Cass report, which Spencer mentioned, but also it's like a self-referential loop of experts, because WPATH has these guidelines, and then you have a lot of these state medical organizations referencing WPATH and WPATH citing them. So he does a nice job of illustrating, especially to the careful reader, the extent to which this universe of experts might be actually quite small and doing a lot more ideology than science or medicine.
I think they call that citation laundering. That might be a James Lindsayism. But yeah, when you just you see it in the humanities, it's been just grotesque for years and years, because it's so much easier to make a really deranged claim, get it published in a peer-reviewed journal, and then require that everyone else cite it anytime they say anything. And suddenly there's this long, scholars have acknowledged for decades that Elagabalus is an appropriate model for the LGBTQ, whatever, you just make this stuff up.
Yeah, and they just copy and paste them. It's like you pay the organization to do the research, get the stuff in there, and then you just copy and paste and rip it out. And it's such a stupid game. So if we could cut that off completely and let legislatures decide, that'd be amazing.
Yep.
Yeah. Studies show, experts have opined.
Yeah. There's a long consensus. These are all phrases. I mean, and it's been an open secret in academia. This is, I guess, in some ways peripheral to the trans issue, but also I think one of the things that that is currently collapsing, and it's why mainstream academia is so panicked, and starts with the Harvard thing, where Claudine Gay turns out to have just plagiarized major chunks of her work, and that the exposure of that system, which exists again to intimidate people out of contesting facially ludicrous claims, by just buttressing them with this enormous barnacle accretion of so supposedly authoritative citations. The way that is kind of falling away, the minute people say that it's ridiculous, of course it all falls apart. But then it turns out that, oh, oops, that's what our major academic institutions exist solely and exclusively to produce. They have nothing else left to offer, and that's I think going to be ongoing.
Yeah. And Thomas cites, I forget if it's one or both of some older abortion decisions, Gonzalez v. Carhart or Planned Parenthood v. Casey. And in one of his dissents, probably, or concurrences, I forget, it's probably a dissent, but he says, we really shouldn't be in this expert citation business as the basis for constitutional law. And he cites this old case called Buck v. Bell, which was one of the definitive cases signing off on some of the eugenics laws and projects at the turn of the progressive era. And then there's, in our more modern times, of course, the great example of pseudoscience being one of the stools on which a particularly controversial set of reasoning rested, not exactly the case or the outcome, was Brown v. Board of Education, which, a big part of that, with the desegregation case in schools, a big part of that decision was this doll study where they gave white and black children white and black dolls, and determined their sense of inferiority given what doll they were holding, and it later turned out to be just junk science. And yet that case stood, and then thereafter the Supreme Court just ignored the fact that one of their central premises of that case had completely collapsed, and just said, as we ruled in Brown, now you have to desegregate your tennis court. And so it was the very loose and tendentious legal reasoning that was erected in the original case undermined future stuff as a matter of jurisprudence, even though a lot of the country agreed with the outcome of prohibiting states from segregating schools by race. Well, maybe we're done with Skrmetti. I just wanted to flag a few. What do we have left coming up in the controversial late June docket for the Supreme Court? For those who don't watch this stuff closely, it's always the final couple weekly releases of court opinions in June before the court goes on summer recess that are the most controversial, because they can drop something that's hot and then get out of town. If you're Clarence Thomas, you hop in the RV and start driving around real America. I don't know what the others will do, but it's a great tradition that Thomas indulges. What do we have left? A big case that we're very interested in, and we've talked about before, Trump v. Casa, which is the birthright citizenship case. We predicted, and I think will be vindicated, that they're not really going to get at the core issue there. I think they're going to punt on that, but we'll see. And then there's this case about Maryland parents in Montgomery County who want to be able to opt their children out of mandatory LGBTQ book assignments. And so that will be interesting to watch. And then a Texas case, which Texas is trying to require everyone accessing online pornography to give proof of age, which would mean you'd have to put your ID or something like that, put your identity online in some fashion. And this is Texas's attempt to exclude or to circumscribe the all too easy access of pornography by children online. So those are a few to watch for in the next couple of weeks. We now wanted to turn to Iran. So for those of you not living under a rock, you know why. We have our own Will Thibeau has come to join us, the director of our American Military Project. A lot of Will's work has focused on the problem of wokeness in the military and the racialization of our armed services, kind of all sorts of affirmative action schemes and de facto and even super secret de jure orders to, for example, make a certain percentage of the Air Force's pilots minorities and women, that sort of thing. But Will also is a veteran himself, and so has been on some of the normal media outlets talking about the Iran issue. So we wanted to have Will on to get his take on the whole thing. So I'll just the quick details, which I shouldn't need to rehearse. I'm sure everyone knows. But over the past week and a half or so, we've seen this interesting process of Trump giving Iran 2 more weeks after the 60-day deadline passed in negotiations. And then there's been some interesting reporting out of the Washington Post about how that whole week unfolded. That is last week, as Trump warmed increasingly to the idea, well, first to the judgment that Iran was not serious about the terms that we wanted to demand, which is they can't enrich uranium, that they'd have to give up that part of their now decades-long attempt to get closer and closer to being able to manufacture a nuclear weapon. And Iran wasn't serious. There's a final European discussion session last week with Iran, and it was clear that Iran was not interested at all in meeting us even halfway, let alone full way. So the talks seem to be at a bit of an end, unless we wanted to just repeat the JCPOA and all of its kind of feckless details from the Obama administration. And so he warmed to the idea of doing this precision strike. And he, interestingly, in this Washington Post piece, this was a new fact for me that I'd only read this morning. The Trump White House was in pretty close contact with some of the internal critics who are more proponents of the restraint school, Charlie Kirk, Steve Bannon, and others, keeping them somewhat apprised of the president's thinking. And Trump basically came to the judgment that, the MAGA base would be fine with a precision strike and they would understand it as he understood it. not as the opening salvo in some new quagmire in the Middle East with boots on the ground, but rather a technologically impressive feat that only the U.S. could pull off, of flying B-2 bombers from Missouri all the way to Iran to take out 3 different nuclear sites and set back, at the very least, for it's been reported 10, 20, even 35 years, Iran's nuclear program. He took that or made that decision. And there was a poll out this morning that I don't think it was conducted by the Free Beacon, but they were reporting on it. Maybe they ran it. Just forgive me of those details. Doesn't really matter. But it turns out that Trump's instincts on the MAGA base were correct. Maybe he had some internal polling that helped him make that decision. I'm not sure. But Trump's base and the GOP in general is very comfortable with a precision strike on Iran, to the tune of 75 or 80%. So it seemed like good politics for Trump, especially if he could confine it to the precision strike and resist the tendency of these sorts of things to run, for events to run beyond the control of politicians and somehow pull him in deeper into this conflict. I'll just flag for everyone, if read an interesting essay, short essay and compact from our own Chris Caldwell, who's more skeptical of Trump's ability to control events going forward and worries that may be pulled along by events, and has given up control of how this might go. But we'll see. The last day and a half has shown Trump announcing a ceasefire, Israel and Iran in their different idiosyncratic ways agreeing to it, then kind of violating it, then Trump getting angry at it. My joke to our group chat was that in preparation for this was that Trump's on like a 3-hour revolving OODA loop, observe, or orient, decide, act, both in terms of public opinion, his rhetoric, the conduct of the 2 major actors in it, that is Iran and Israel. So we'll see how it all shakes out. But I'll cede the floor to Will. Will, you can take this in any direction you want. What do you make of the last week, and especially the last 3 days?
Yeah, I am trying to decide who's vindicated and who's not most recently, but I in many ways, candidly, I think we will end up back where we started before Israel started their airstrike campaign, with the exception, of course, I think the devil really is in the details here of the exact status of the Iranian nuclear program. Obviously, we can presume it's heavily damaged. I don't think anyone even publicly admits or concedes that it's destroyed. I would be surprised, even Ryan, frankly, if it is 10 years delayed. I think that's a kind of a best case scenario. And, I think honestly, 3 years would be perhaps even more than the United States could hope for. But I say that we are in the same places where we started, because at the end of the day, kind of a main kind of point I've been trying to socialize is this ends if the mandate of President Trump will carry the day, if his end state will carry the day, which is Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, that will only happen by 2 ways. There are only 2 options for frameworks that would guarantee that, and the status quo is not one of them. The one framework is an escalation of the violence. I don't, call it a regime change war, but at the end of the day, you need a verification measure that is by force, that happens by force. And the other way that you could verify a nuclear regime is a deal. And obviously the JCPOA was a deal, insufficient in many ways, but perhaps, I'm not sure that the alternatives are better. That's, perhaps another conversation. There was some evidence that I find interesting that Iran was willing to accept American inspectors on the ground before after the 5th round of negotiations. There was an opening to American investigators, which would be a marked improvement from the JCPOA. So if that evidence remains, I do think diplomacy is still possible and necessary if you kind of, I think, honestly examine the political climate. So to my point, obviously it's good news that there's a ceasefire, but it's not sustainable no matter, I think, what your worldview is.
Well, what do you think happens next?
I think Trump will, you got to give it a few days for the ceasefire to take effect, and for military orders to, be followed to the full extent of I'm trying to decide if it's President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu. But I do think that there's going to be some sort of diplomatic agreement reached. I honestly, partly because I think there has to be. And this is why I do think realists are vindicated to some degree, despite whatever the kind of Sunday afternoon to Monday morning, Truth Social messaging looked like. It's clear that President Trump doesn't seek further involvement. There is not an actual appetite for regime change, even if the threat exists. And so in my mind, I think you have to just be realistic about this.
And that agreement would include inspection, I would imagine, in some way, right?
Yeah, I think it has to. So it would still be IAEA inspections, but a big sticking point from the Obama JCPOA is that the Iranians didn't allow any Americans to be part of those inspection teams, which, if you ask some, opened up the chances of fraud or evasion pretty significantly. And so that's one kind of thing that I would look for if there's openness from the Iranians, to have Americans as part of the inspection teams and reviewing their nuclear facilities, wherever they are and whatever they become in the future. And then the other thing is the enrichment levels. There's some messaging that I've been paying attention to that has changed over the last 10 days. It was obviously, the enduring message has been no nuclear weapon for Iran. But even since Israel started their campaign of airstrikes, there was this discussion of zero enrichment, no uranium whatsoever. And that's changed certainly to the absence of highly enriched uranium. Like, these are the levels that Vice President Vance in particular has been talking about on a lot of his media appearances. And then President Trump, in front of the press pool, has been explicit on his expectation that they don't have a means of weaponization. And so that obviously means, the enrichment thresholds under the JCPOA were 3.57%, something like that. I don't necessarily expect anything better, frankly, but I think the means of validating will be what President Trump seeks to extract from concessions. Of course, the question is if in my mind is if Israel will accept that. I'll kind of transition it, and I'm kind of happily kind of jump back to the diplomatic considerations. But this is where kind of the military affairs and the defense policy comes into play. Obviously, the operation of the Israeli army, especially the Israeli Defense Forces, in the opening 48 hours was pretty spectacular. They, perhaps better than any military on the earth, integrate covert operations with kinetic airstrikes and precision activity better than anyone. But I do think there are some serious questions of their ability to sustain that kind of success over, really even beyond 2 weeks. There was some credible reporting in the Wall Street Journal that even 7 days into this exchange of volleys of rockets and missiles, they were below 50% on their interceptor battery supply. It was something like $200 million a day worth of interceptors being expended, which is significant even for America. And I think they were eventually going to run into the issue of math, that it's a lot easier to shoot things than it is to catch, or to defend. And that's just a reality, right? You can't. I was an infantryman, so I'm biased to say this, but you can't win a war lobbing missiles from 1,000 miles away. Obviously, you'll cause a lot of pain. But again, back to my kind of point about validating the status of the nuclear program, you can't do much else if you don't have boots on the ground. And covert boots only do so much for you. So I do think this kind of status quo is going to run out of steam eventually. Obviously, there's reporting on if Netanyahu is asking Trump to escalate, or if he was asking Trump to help him get a way out. But I do think Israel sees that they couldn't proceed apace forever. And I don't think America can either. I mean, we still have to, although perhaps, President Trump scratched his interventionist itch, the infrastructure of the administration, the people there, and I think the energy of the bureaucracy is still oriented towards a pivot to Asia in many ways. and it's hard to pivot to Asia if you have two carrier strike groups in a very crowded Arabian Sea, Strait of Hormuz area, and then evidently submarines, right? So there's a lot of combat power that I don't think we wanted to keep there for much longer, which to me is just evidence of the inertia that will push this towards a diplomatic solution. I think in many ways this doesn't change the ultimate time horizon, and kind of we're still left with this kind of inextricable solution. But there is, I think that has to be the answer in the coming month or so.
Yeah, in the age-old category of matching means to ends from America's perspective, Will, given what you said, especially about the pivot to Asia, but also about Trump's reluctance, if not absolute aversion to any sort of actual war with actual American troops on the ground, it seems like diplomacy would be the only way to go going forward. Especially, and Caldwell brings us up in his piece in Compact Mag, I think the title of which is, what would an Iran war do to America? He said Israel has just the problem of size, and you mentioned a piece of it, which is the interceptor versus ballistic missile calculus and math, and the expense of it all, but also the fact that Israel is 8 million people and Iran is 90 million, and so yeah, absent direct American intervention, it seems like diplomacy would be the only thing left. The question is, what will Iran now trust, as it appears also from some of the reporting that that Trump's 2 weeks thing was just a feint, and he basically was decided almost ahead of time that was just a lie, and that three days later it was all done.
Does Iran have 90 million people? Is that how many there are, Ryan?
Exactly how many people?
Yeah, exactly. Can you
I swore it was 91.
But isn't this to say that if there's a diplomatic solution and there's actually a inspection regime in place upon them after being bombed like this, you would think that actually you could, sort of kind of count on that, right? I mean, and that would be an improvement.
Well, I think that's the big question: is how incentivized are they to come to the deal more seriously than they were previously? I'm still not quite sure how to measure that. Especially if some of these reports about what they were willing to give up before the war started is true. The reason why I was really worried about even airstrikes, for American airstrikes, was just the ability for the Iranians to truly take their program underground. And if this sprint to the bomb was so feasible, I think I'm worried about a world absent a deal where you're seeing a nuclear test before the end of the year or a year from now. I think the Iranians are kind of scared enough, and in many ways, though, I think the best case scenario would have been to try and move to a diplomacy after the first 72 hours. Like, Israel killed those IRGC commanders, took out a bunch of nuclear scientists. The shock and awe was in full effect, and they could have been like, "All right, MFers, come to the table now." Then there's only the picture of the strength of Israel, the at least tacit support of America, and some real credibility. I do think there's a question, waning capabilities on either side, and kind of what exists now as a credible threat to Iran. Obviously, there's plenty left, but I think in many ways they're in a stronger position now than they would have been a week ago. Doesn't mean a deal is impossible, but we should be candid about that. Dropping American bombs helps you wake up in many ways. But the other thing, I'm happy to jump back to that too, is what it says about this pivot to Asia for this specific the Operation Midnight Hammer. It in many ways highlights why realigning military resources to any other part of the world is really challenging. By some accounts, the only known quantity of GBU-57s, the bunker busters we have, was 20. And depending on some people say we dropped 9, some say we dropped 6. But either way, we're probably at about 50% of our capacity of bunker busters. Presumably there are some targets in China that are bunker buster worthy. And, I don't think we'll be able to just kind of coast on in from Missouri, a fleet of 7 B-2s and a whole host of, 15 fighter aircraft, and just kind of waltz into contested Chinese airspace with the same, the same courage and kind of cunning skill. So in many ways, it kind of really brings home the importance of what our military needs to look like if we're going to reorient combat power to the Pacific. And that's the kind of the conversation that I want to start having kind of out of my seat here at Call, because I don't think we can expect completely absent, Chinese air defense capability like the Iranians were. I think they're, obviously just the scale of the problem is completely different. And our strategic bombing capabilities are not big enough or grand enough to cripple the parallel Chinese capability as we did with Iran. And that just goes, it's perhaps obvious, but I think it presents in a little bit of a contrast, the dilemma and, the fact that we really still are a military position for low intensity conflict on the ground, uncontested airspace, that we don't have to worry about too much. And that's not necessarily going to be the future, even though it's our most recent example of, of kinetic activity.
Well, to what extent was this essentially a demonstration to China and Russia of U.S. capability? I mean, on some level, it was this tactical, strategic, logistical triumph in a way to bring all these planes over, at least to just show China and Russia, okay, this is what you're up against. And then to what extent is the question of Iran getting a nuclear bomb kind of like a red herring? I mean, clearly you can always have well, we don't know if maybe they have centrifuges hidden in a closet somewhere. Maybe they're, we don't know if we've accounted for every gram of enriched uranium. So, I mean, is it really just about degrading Iran's status and stature as this, rival regional power? Now their proxies are all kind of in tatters. They don't have the same ability to, supply the Houthis or Hezbollah or what's left of Hamas. Syria's gone. I mean, what can they do? And so this was kind of like a final embarrassment of the Iranian regime. I mean, because they've been annoying the whole region for 40 years. Like Turkey hates them, Saudi hates them, Kuwait, everybody hates them. They're annoying.
Well, and in many ways, they kind of serve as this helpful villain around which a broader Arab-Israeli coalition can be formed, which I again think is kind of helpful. No, but to answer your second question first, I think that is my exact position. I'm not all that convinced. I think the step, everyone kind of makes the assumption that the steps from 60% enrichment to like detonating nuclear bombs is, a long weekend of some research. And I think it's a lot more complicated, frankly. But even let's say Iran did get the bomb. I don't think they want to keep it. They don't want to use them. And I'm not trying to, compare apples to oranges, but right, we saw two nuclear armed nations that probably hate each other at least as much as Israel and Iran do, in Pakistan and India. I mean, they went to, they went to war over a long weekend. But I think we all thought that, hey, if you told me 15 years ago that Pakistan and India were in a shooting war and Pakistan was shooting down a half dozen Indian Air Force jets, I'd be like, oh, it's nuclear war. And it kind of just went away. And, the North Korea was another example. They have probably 15 nuclear weapons, at least right now. And I guess we're just assuming assuming they won't use them. It's obviously a strong consideration for the Pacific, but to your point, Seth, I think we do have to, be a little bit more grounded here. It is about, I think, Israeli regional hegemony, the Arab states in their kind of hegemony over the Muslim world, the Muslim Middle East. So I agree with you. It's a long way of saying it. The question, your thoughts about demonstration to Russia and China, perhaps. I think the capability that was interesting was the submarines launching the 30 cruise missiles, just because that kind of, if we all can be like OSINT warriors, reading the different accounts who show us the flight paths of different airplanes and think we have everything figured out. I don't think anyone necessarily expected a cruise missile attack, partly because I'm not really convinced the cruise missiles did anything against those. Isfahan, I think, was the target there. But it's just an indication that, hey, we have these machines that are always there, and that a moment's notice can rain hell on you, and that is compelling, and that is really our strategic overmatch, no matter what adversary, is our nuclear submarine fleet
and machines that are there that you can't find and do anything about, right? Yeah,
I do wonder. I'm curious if Russia and China, there's the now famous fleet of B-2s flying west to the Pacific. I'm curious if they saw the actual attacking force flying east. I assume they did, but I don't know. I'll just my perhaps controversial comment. I think Russia feels great about themselves militarily. Maybe not from a strategic perspective, right? No one can project power. What Secretary Hegseth and General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, said is true. No one can project power like we did. But Russia is a modern military in the fullest sense, in that they don't rely on kind of cumbersome weapon systems of 25-year programs of record. They've modernized to an extent where they can surge capabilities from their defense industrial base to the battlefield in 6-8 weeks. I think the question that I often ask is, if you swapped a U.S. infantry brigade out for a Ukrainian infantry brigade on the front lines in Ukraine, what would that look like? And I think it would be pretty ugly for perhaps 3 or 4 months, just because we haven't understood the extent to which things like drones have modernized the battlefield, the intense requirement for communications discipline, just soldiers not bringing their cell phones in their pocket, simple stuff like that. I almost think it's irrelevant, but certainly the message to China is our submarines are always watching and we can always kill you. Perhaps true for a B-2 as well, but my point is our B-2 fleet, that again, it's a little unclear, but that was probably more than half of our functional B-2 fleet.
17 of them, right, Will?
Yeah,
I think. Yeah.
Involved in the whole operation. If Claremont, to give us some credit, we broke a story that there is a pilot shortage due to DEI requirements at flight school that, combined with maintenance issues, took the operational B-2 fleet to 2 aircraft during the Biden administration. So it's not insignificant.
That's comforting.
Right. When you're talking like 7 B-2s, and then if you include the deception flight, that's easily well over half of our B-2 fleet. And it's not like we're just going to be able to just send the B-2s to fight China. It's going to be a whole different ballgame.
Or build new ones. I mean,
well, yeah, right.
Quickly, yeah.
Well, there's a replacement for the B-2. That's I guess what a neocon would tell me or something, like, hey, the B-20, you're going to be able to build more B-21s, but a B-21 can only carry 1 bunker buster, for example. So there's going to be a give and take in the future.
Yeah, interesting stuff. I mean, certainly something to watch, as Trump is now at NATO, right? Or at the NATO meeting. Well, I think we can leave it there for now. Thanks, Will. We've been in the habit lately of giving some recommendations for cultural stuff. I'll just quickly report from the family vacation. Went to Lake Toxaway, which is about an hour south and a little west of Asheville, North Carolina, Trump country. I think we were driving into town. It's a beautiful lake at about 3,000 feet. Privately owned, and the community around it private. I think it was dammed in the late 19th century. The dam failed in some big storms, and then they rebuilt it in the 30s. Anyway, beautiful part of the country out in the Smoky Mountains and near the Blue Ridge Mountains. I encourage everyone to go spend some time there. Great hiking, river stuff, good golf. It was a nice time. And I say Trump country because we were driving in near Brevard, which is close to Toxaway, and in downtown Brevard. On the day we were leaving, Saturday the 21st, they were having a Trumpapalooza fest, which was just a little gathering in downtown Brevard with people out in regalia celebrating their president. No notable appearances. It looked like more of a community affair, but it's fun to be in Scotch-Irish country. Didn't really spend any time in Asheville. I hear it's still kind of hurting, obviously, from the hurricane last year. go to the Biltmore Estate if you've never been. Maybe wait a year till they fix it up. It was the private residence of Vanderbilt, and at a certain point was the largest private residence in the country. A very cool place to check out. One fun detail about the Biltmore, just to sell it more, because it is a very cool place. You can stand on like the back balcony of the Biltmore and look out across the rolling hills, and it looks like it's been that way since creation. You know, beautiful oak glens and meadows and stuff. But it was all basically not strip mined, but strip forested, and it was a huge Frederick Law Olmsted landscape project, which is now over 100 years old. And so it's a nice example of that wonderful man who also built Central Park, among other things. So it's a cool place to check out. Well, the actual cultural recommendation I have, it's an oldie but goodie. I think I may have brought this up like 2 years ago, but I've just been enjoying it as a sort of decompression thing for a certain style of nerd, which I will confess to being. But Leo McKern was an Australian stage actor who, you know, ditched his Australian accent young, and basically, for all intents and purposes, when you observe him now, you just think he's English. But he was in this show for, I think, almost 15 years, called Rumpole of the Bailey. So if you're into that sort of thing, he's a barrister. He's a creature of the Old Bailey, which is the courts where a lot of criminal defendants go through in London. And he's a Oxford Book of English verse quoting, irascible, hilarious barrister who has a kind of populist Whiggish streak, and wants everyone to get their day in court, and is fighting against the corrupt local police, and with a bunch of colorful characters, some of them kind of petty crime families. It's just a delightful show. If you think you might be into that sort of thing, given my description, I encourage you to check it out. You have to watch it on over here. Watch it on the BritBox section of Amazon Prime, which is a small subscription fee, but written by this guy Mortimer, who had that kind of Whiggish left of center view, the grand glories of the golden thread of trial by jury in the common law tradition. And but it's a product of the 80s and early 90s, so it's delightfully uninflected by most PC stuff, and to the extent that it gets into it's sort of set in the late 70s and early 80s in London. So to the extent that it gets to any politics, it half the time is just mocking left-wing foolery. So anyway, a lot of fun. What about you, Spencer?
Well, first of all, my parents are obsessed with Rumpole of the Bailey, and I have never watched it. So this is clearly my indication to check it out. When you were away, Ryan, I recommended a video game, so I feel that I must now redeem myself with a work of classic literature. And luckily for me,
wait a minute, just real quick, what video game?
Oh, dude, it's Expedition 33, Clair Obscur. Okay. And do you like RPGs at all?
Yeah, I mean it's also for my kids, but I'm looking for beautiful video games or cool video games. Yes.
It's exceptionally beautiful. The most striking thing about it is the visual art and the music. And I guess listen to last week's episode if you want to hear me rant about what's so great about it. Yeah. But yeah, it's terrific. However, I do read books, listeners, I promise. One of these incredibly annoying Twitter accounts posted a picture of the summer reading stack, and it was all like vomitously inane business self-help books, like the kind of anodyne garbage that really sets my teeth on edge. So in a moment of increasingly frequent peevishness, I just tweeted, like, all of these are the literary equivalent of a meeting that could have been an email, except randomly in the stack was Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, which I then downloaded onto my Kindle so that I could make some point about it in the Twitter thread. Whereupon, fast forward a couple days later, I haven't read this book since high school. I've done the worst thing a man can do, which is I've forgotten my mother's advice, and I've left the house without a book. I'm at a bar, I'm waiting for some friends, and I just start reading my Kindle version of Notes from Underground. That book, I mean, Dostoevsky was a prophet just across the board of basically all modern pathologies. Nietzsche famously said, "This is the only psychologist who has anything left to teach me." And Notes from Underground is Dostoevsky the psychologist, just at his absolute finest, purely distilled, super short book, really like actually a quick read, kind of almost a dramatic monologue, but it's all about like resentment and the ways in which modern man is kind of trapped between his desire to transcend into Superman and his like lingering sense of abjection before God. And there's just so much good stuff in it, including a repeated motif that I had kind of forgotten, that like nobody is subtle enough to understand my personal pathology. Like it's like this perfectly calibrated description of how people now talk about their like obscure psychological diseases that they can't let go of because of this, that, and the other. Such a great book, and so worthwhile and easy if you're looking for like a classic to read or to give your kids for the summer. Notes from Underground. I like Michael Katz as a translator of Russian rather than Pavir and Volokonsky, who have been popular, but your mileage may vary.
Can I just say real quick? I had the opportunity to kind of tutor teach that book as part of a few courses a few years ago, and even with students who were more, they were all more creative, right? But they were, some of them weren't great students. Modern students immediately, like it just right off the pages, right? I mean, it's like speaks to the incels, it speaks to the, I mean, it just, they all get it right away.
Yeah.
And that was really cool to see because of everything you're saying.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, I can see how that would be for sure. And it is, it has that advantage. Kind of like Catcher in the Rye, actually. Like, I sort of see why people give Catcher in the Rye to, I suppose, this short. It's got a strong narrator. But I think this is a much better. Yeah, Ryan is groaning. I agree. This is a much better book.
This is the alternative, the much better
exactly.
Alternative.
Like, don't give your kids Catcher in the Rye. Give them Notes from Underground.
All right, so I've got one book. I just finally started Umberto Eco's In the Name of the Rose. And I think Spencer Ryan, somebody, I mentioned that name and they were like, oh boy, you don't know what you're getting into. Now I know what I'm getting into. And yeah, I'm about 100 pages in and it is enlightening and just packed. I think Eco was just trying to put every word he knew, every thought he ever had into this book in novel form, set in the 14th century. So it's fascinating. I mean, it's and I actually want to watch the movie. Sean Connery and Christian Slater, I think they made a movie version in the 80s. So watch that. And then also still doing Beach Boys Summer. So I'm listening through all the classic Beach Boys albums and just getting to kind of their weird turn, like in the late 60s, early 70s, Surf's Up. I think that came out in 1971. So Brian Wilson, obviously at that point, was having some serious issues. And it's weird hearing a band, Surfing USA in 1963 and like getting into these like almost nihilistic doldrums by 1971. So it's kind of very telling. Kind of tracks almost with like, you look at who won the Oscars in the early 60s, Sound of Music, who won it by the end, some X-rated movie, Midnight Cowboy. So it's kind of an interesting cultural, just capturing what was going on at that time. So it's just fascinating, but I'm sure I'll continue with Beach Boys Summer, for the rest of the summer for sure.
Excellent. What about you, Seth? Anything good?
Yeah. Speaking of North Carolina, one of my favorite writers is Lionel Shriver. She's she wrote We Have to Talk About Kevin, which they made a movie out of. It was kind of notorious some years ago. She's, on our side politically, more or less. She has a very interesting book called Should We Stay or Should We Go? About this middle-aged couple who make a suicide pact that when they turn 80, they will kill themselves just to spare themselves the indignities of old age. And then she runs through about 15 iterations each chapter of what happens when they get to that point. And just from like the absurd to the tragic. And it's very interesting. And then in the end, it kind of, you see how it really resolves. It's a really good book.
Sounds great. It's called Should We Stay or Should We Go?
Yeah.
Okay. Nice.
Excellent.
So I don't have anything earth-shaking, but after years of not listening to Bob Dylan, because I'd listened to him so much and figured I'd heard all there was to hear, recently this week I just went back to Blood on the Tracks, which is a classic album. And you need to realize, if you're anything like me, that he is 84 years old and won't be with us very longer. And I feel like when he and Willie Nelson pass away, we kind of have an epoch ending. And Willie Nelson, by the way, is still touring at 92. So this is something you can actually go see, which would be good to get it in if that's something you're inclined to do. And then two, more pop culture kind of things that are going on right now, which is this Mind Enterprises band, these videos. I don't know if you guys have seen them going online. They get this Italian vibe going, very summer vibe of sort of like funky discotheque techno. And if you've seen the video of them, you fall in love with the music immediately because there's just two goofy looking guys rocking out on the synthesizer. And Mind Enterprises is just a good summer vibe, fun. And then before I stop, this guy Thomas Skinner, TV personality who's from the UK, his heartwarming videos every week of him like having a beer with his shirt off and his family, or like being in a bar or whatever, are just, they take the internet by storm because he's a very likable fellow. He's a big dude, but a normal looking dude who also just is pure, whatever spirit of the UK that they're trying to squelch. And so people will put these videos online and they usually say something like, this is what the Romans saw when they arrived in 43 AD, for a reason, because every time I watch one, I know at least one person from the UK, not Matthew Marston, but he's close. He's close to this. But another guy in the area who's sort of like this. It's just I love the fact that those videos are popular. So Mind Enterprises, I think that gave that a thumbs up. Thomas Skinner gives a thumbs up for the videos. And then we got Dylan and Willie Nelson on, what we'll say is their final tour, but God knows, maybe they'll still be touring and when he's over 100.
Yeah, some great American storytellers, Willie Nelson and Bob Dylan, with very different backgrounds. The Southern boy and the Jewish kid. So good stuff. All right. Well, thanks everybody once again for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more about our work, as always, go to www.claremont.org. If you want to support it, just go /donate after that. Check out all of the work at the Center for the American Way of Life in DC, including Will Thibeau's work on de-wokifying the military at dc.claremont.org. Go to americanmind.org for all the stuff you know and love, and the Claremont Review books, not the, but ClaremontReviewBooks.com. Thanks for listening. Please rate the show, and thank you to the engineering crew, the brothers Gannon, Ryan, and Jake. We will talk to you all next week.